The wind off the river had teeth that night, the kind that slid under your collar and stayed there like it owned you. And as I cut through the waterfront park in late January, I kept my head down and my hands buried in my pockets like I could hide from my own thoughts. Portland looked clean and glossy from a distance, neon smeared across wet sidewalks, the river turning the city lights into something almost beautiful. But up close, it was all the same rushing faces and shrugging shoulders, everyone moving fast, everyone pretending not to see each other. I just clocked out from the airport operations desk after another shift of delays, complaints, and broken luggage, work that kept me busy but never touched the hollow place inside me. And I was halfway home before I realized I was taking the long way, the way I usually avoided, the way Hannah used to love. 2 years earlier, black ice on Highway 26 had taken her from me so fast my brain still felt like it hadn't caught up. And since then, my life had turned into a loop of microwave dinners, sleep that didn't count, and mornings that arrived whether I was ready or not. I didn't cry much anymore. I'd learned how to hold grief like a stone in my chest and walk around with it, heavy but familiar, like an old injury you stop mentioning because people get uncomfortable. A train had stalled, traffic was snarled, and I'd told myself I was only cutting through Governor Tom McCall Waterfront Park to save time, but the truth was the river always did this to me. It reminded me how something can keep flowing after it's stolen everything from you. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a dumped backpack on a bench near the bare-limbed cherry trees, a dark lump against the wet wood. But then the backpack shifted and I realized it was a boy curled into himself, small and still, like someone had set him there and forgotten to come back. He looked 10, maybe 11, knees pulled to his chest, rain jacket too thin and too small, sneakers soaked dark with slush. He wasn't crying, which somehow made it worse. Crying would have made sense, but he was just staring toward the river with eyes fixed on nothing, like waiting was a job he'd been doing for hours. My first instinct, trained by grief and self-preservation, was to keep walking, to not invite someone else's pain into my body when I could barely carry my own, but my feet didn't listen. I slowed, then stopped, the quiet of the park making my footsteps sound too loud, and I approached like I might spook him. "Hey," I said, and even my voice sounded unfamiliar, rough from disuse. "You okay out here?" He turned his head just enough to look at me. His cheeks were blotched red from cold, eyelashes damp, and when he blinked, it was slow and deliberate, like he was confirming something. Then he whispered, so soft it felt like the river might swallow it, "You're late." The words hit me in a way that made my stomach drop. "What?" I managed, because that was all my brain could produce. He swallowed, his teeth clicking once. "My uncle said you'd come. He said if I waited here, you'd come." I stared at him, trying to assemble logic out of fog. "Kid, what's your name?" "Carter," he said, steady, even though his whole body was shaking. "I'm supposed to stay on this bench until you get here." I looked around, expecting someone to rush over, a frantic parent, a guardian, anything. But a cyclist rolled past, a couple walked their dog, and nobody even glanced our way, like a boy freezing on a bench was just another piece of scenery. "Where's your mom? Your dad?" I asked, and his eyes dipped to the ground. "Don't have a dad," he said. "Mom's not here." That sentence landed like a shove, and before I could think I was shrugging off my thick airport jacket and draping it over his shoulders, it swallowed him, and he flinched at the warmth like it surprised him. I knelt to zip it up and saw his hands, pale, trembling hard. "What do you mean your uncle told you I'd come?" I asked softly. "Who's your uncle?" He hesitated, searching for words. "Uncle Theo. He lived with us. He used to take me here to watch the boats. He said this bench was safe." My throat tightened. "Where is he now?" Carter lifted his eyes, and for a second he looked older than he should have. "He's gone," he said. "He didn't come home yesterday. But before he left, he told me a plan. He said if something happened, I had to do exactly what he said. I had to wait. He said a man who walks like he's carrying a rock inside his chest would find me. He said you'd have tired eyes and smell like coffee, and he said..." His voice dropped lower, the certainty in it making my skin prickle. "You'd know what to do." I should have told myself it was coincidence that it could describe 100 men on a winter night, but it felt like he'd reached into my ribs and named what was living there. I forced a breath, stood, and offered my hand. He took it without hesitation, his fingers cold enough to hurt, and I heard myself say, "Come on, we're not staying out here." We walked toward the closest place with lights, the little precinct office tucked beside a row of closed food carts, and Carter didn't question me, didn't resist, just followed with a trust that made me feel both honored and terrified. Inside, heat-blasted air that smelled like dust, and a tired officer behind the desk looked up sharply. "What's going on?" "I found him at the waterfront," I said. "He's alone." Carter stayed tight to my side, still gripping my sleeve. The officer's expression softened slightly. "Name?" "Carter," he said. The officer typed it in, and something in his face tightened like he'd swallowed something bitter. He stood up and asked, "And your uncle's name?" Carter answered without blinking. "Theo Merrick." The officer leaned closer to me, voice low. "Sir," he said, "we had a call last night. A man matching that name was reported missing near the Hawthorne Bridge, and he left a note." The officer's words hung in the overheated air, like fog that refused to clear. And for a second, I couldn't tell what I was hearing, because my brain kept snagging on the phrase he'd said so casually. He left a note. As if that was a normal thing that happened on a Tuesday night in a city where people pretended not to see each other. "A note?" I repeated, my mouth dry, and the officer nodded, rubbing at his jaw like he'd already lived this conversation too many times. He told me they'd gotten a call late the night before. Theo Merrick reported missing near the Hawthorne Bridge. Backpack found on the walkway. No sign of him afterward. And he didn't say the rest outright, but I understood the shape of what he meant in the way his eyes flicked toward the boy and then away, like looking too directly at a kid's grief felt like staring into the sun. Carter stood beside me with the airport jacket zipped all the way to his chin, listening with that unnerving calm children sometimes wear when the world has already knocked them down and they're too tired to react properly. And when he looked up at me, his face wasn't pleading. It was certain, like the bench had trained him to believe in waiting. "See?" he murmured so quietly the officer almost didn't hear. "He told me you'd come." The officer exhaled, reached for a file folder, and said Child Services had been contacted and someone was on the way, and as he spoke, he kept his voice gentle like he was handling something fragile, which made my chest tighten because it meant the situation was worse than I'd thought. I crouched in front of Carter, keeping my voice low. "Hey, you did the right thing coming here," I told him, even though he hadn't come here. He'd waited for me to bring him, and he nodded like he was checking off instructions. While we waited, the station felt too bright and too loud in small ways. A phone ringing behind a door, a printer spitting paper, a radio crackling with someone's tired voice, and all of it made the moment on the bench feel like it belonged to a different world. 10 minutes later, a woman walked in carrying a canvas bag, her hair pulled back, her eyes kind but worn down at the edges by a job that asked her to catch people after they'd fallen. "I'm Elise Larkin," she said, showing a badge. "I'm with Child Welfare." She knelt in front of Carter, introduced herself like he was a person and not a case, offered him a granola bar and a little carton of juice, and he accepted both with polite, distant obedience. Then she turned to me. "You brought him in?" "Yeah," I said, and realized I was still holding Carter's sleeve between my fingers like a lifeline. "I'm Jordan." "Thank you, Jordan," she said, and the gratitude in her voice felt real, not automatic. She opened a notebook. "Walk me through exactly what happened." So I did. My walk through the park, the bench, the thin jacket, the way he wasn't crying, the way he'd looked up and told me I was late. I told her about the prophecy, the description. Rock in the chest, tired eyes, coffee smell, and as soon as I repeated it, her pen stopped. She didn't blink for a full beat. "He said that?" she asked carefully, and when I nodded, something shifted in her expression from professional calm to stunned recognition, as if a puzzle piece had just slammed into place. She reached into the file folder the officer had set on the counter and pulled out a photocopied page, creased and smudged. The handwriting on it slanted like it had been written by someone whose hands couldn't hold steady. "I need you to read this," she said, and my pulse thudded in my ears as I took it. The first line made my stomach drop. "To the stranger who notices the boy." My eyes blurred as I read, because the letter wasn't angry or dramatic. It was terrified. full of love, full of a desperate hope that the world still contained at least one decent person, and it begged whoever found Carter to keep him warm, to not let him disappear into revolving doors and fluorescent rooms and paperwork that forgot faces. By the time I reached the end, tears were sliding down my cheeks before I could stop them. Not just for Theo, not just for Carter, but for how thin the line was between being saved and being overlooked. I looked over at Carter again, small feet swinging above the floor, juice carton crinkling in his hands, and Miss Larkin's voice softened. Legally, she said, he has to go to emergency placement tonight, a short-term group home, until we locate relatives or a vetted foster option. The words group home hit like a siren, and before I could talk myself out of it, before fear could grab the wheel, I heard my own voice cut through the room, steady and absolute. No, Miss Larkin blinked. I'm sorry? He's not going to a group home, I said, and my hands were shaking even though my voice wasn't. Not tonight. She studied me for a long moment, the practiced caution returning to her eyes. Jordan, I understand what you're feeling, she said gently, but you're a stranger. We can't just... Then start the process, I interrupted, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. Background checks, classes, home visit, whatever you need, start it now. Her gaze sharpened, not unkind, but serious in a way that made me feel like she was looking straight through me. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do that? For a moment, I couldn't answer her, because the real reason wasn't something you could wrap up neatly in a sentence, and because the second I tried to explain it, I knew I'd have to admit out loud how empty my life had become. I looked at Carter, his shoulders swallowed by my jacket, his eyes too steady for a kid who should have been safe at home, and something in me cracked in a clean, quiet way. Because I know what it feels like to come home to silence, I said, voice rough. Because I know what it feels like when your life stops and the calendar doesn't. And because if I walk away from him tonight, I'll be a ghost forever. Miss Larkin's expression softened, but it didn't turn naive. It turned careful, like she'd seen promises made in emotional storms and watched them evaporate under pressure. Jordan, she said, lowering her voice, this isn't a sleepover. This is custody. This is responsibility. If I even consider an emergency placement with you, it means a judge. It means paperwork. It means your apartment has to be assessed. It means you could be committing to something that changes every part of your life. Good, I heard myself say, and it came out more desperate than brave. Let it change my life. Behind us, the officer cleared his throat and turned his body slightly, giving us a sliver of privacy in a room that didn't really have any. Carter's gaze kept flicking between me and Miss Larkin as if he were watching adults negotiate weather, waiting to see which way the storm would blow. Miss Larkin crouched again, bringing herself level with him. Carter, she said gently, do you know any other family? Grandparents? An aunt? Anyone we can call? Carter shook his head once. Uncle Theo was it, he said simply. He said you would take me to the warm place. He said a lady with a tired smile would ask me questions, he said. His mouth tightened, and for the first time his calm slipped just enough for fear to show through. He said, don't let them put me in the big house. Miss Larkin's eyes closed briefly, like she was swallowing something painful, and when she opened them, she looked at me again. Do you have any experience with kids? She asked. I almost laughed, but it would have sounded like glass breaking. Not since the word stuck. I forced it out. Not since I lost my fiancé. It wasn't the whole truth. I hadn't lost a child like the other story. I hadn't had to bury a son. But I'd lost enough to know the shape of grief, to know what it does to your sleep, to your appetite, to your ability to imagine tomorrow without flinching. Miss Larkin studied me for a long, heavy moment. Okay, she said finally, and I felt my lungs pull air like they'd been starving. Here's what I can do. I can request an emergency shelter order. That requires me to make a call right now. An after-hours judge will ask you questions. If they approve, you'd be a temporary placement for tonight only. Tomorrow, we start the formal process. Do it, I said immediately, before fear could tap me on the shoulder and remind me of all the ways I could fail. Ms. Larkin stepped aside with her phone, speaking in low, clipped sentences, and the officer handed me a stack of forms so thick it felt like a punishment. I filled in my name, my address, my job, my history, answering questions that made my life look like a list of risk factors. Single, grieving, no children in the home, no partner, no support network mentioned. The pen kept slipping in my fingers because they were damp with sweat. After a while, Miss Larkin waved me over and put her phone on speaker. "This is Judge Sandoval," a woman's voice said, sharp and tired, the kind of tired that came from making decisions at night that would follow people for years. "Mr. Rivers, I'm told you're requesting emergency placement of a minor child you do not know." "Yes, Your Honor," I said, throat tight. "Why?" "Because he was found alone in the cold," I said, and then, because it was the truth that mattered, because his guardian left a note asking whoever found him to keep him safe, and because I can. The judge asked about my apartment, bedrooms, heat, smoke detectors. She asked about my job schedule. She asked if I'd ever been arrested, ever been investigated, ever had substance issues. Miss Larkin chimed in with her professional assessment, and I could hear in her tone that she was balancing compassion with caution, giving the judge reasons to trust without pretending the world was simple. At one point, the judge asked, "Mr. Rivers, are you emotionally stable enough to care for a traumatized child?" The question hit like a fist because I didn't feel stable. I felt like a man holding a cracked cup with both hands, praying it wouldn't spill. But I looked at Carter, small on the chair, shoulders tight, and I answered the only way I could. "I'm not perfect," I said, "but I will not leave him alone." Silence stretched. Then the judge exhaled. "Emergency placement granted for one night," she said. "Child welfare will conduct a home visit within 24 hours. Mr. Rivers, understand this does not guarantee long-term placement." My knees went weak with relief. "I understand," I whispered. Miss Larkin ended the call and immediately moved into action, brisk and efficient, like she couldn't afford to let emotions slow her down. "All right," she said, turning to Carter with a gentleness that didn't sound forced. "You're going home with Jordan tonight? Tomorrow I'll come by, okay?" Carter stared at her, then at me, and I saw his careful composure wobble. He didn't smile, but he nodded, and when he slid off the chair, he reached for my hand as if it had always been his anchor. We stepped out into the night together, the cold waiting on the other side of the door, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than numbness move through my chest. It wasn't happiness. It was purpose, sudden and terrifying, like a light clicking on in a room I'd forgotten existed. By the time we stepped back outside, the cold hit us like a slap, sharper than before, because the warmth of the precinct had tricked my skin into forgetting how brutal January could be. And Carter tucked himself closer to my side without saying a word as we crossed the slick sidewalk toward my car. The streetlights turned the puddles into mirrors, and for a second I caught our reflection. Me hunched and tense like I was bracing for impact, him swallowed in my airport jacket like a kid wearing armor that didn't quite fit. And it was so strange seeing myself with a child again, that my chest tightened the way it did when a song came on that Hannah used to hum. Carter climbed into the passenger seat carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch anything. And when I started the engine, the heater coughed warm air that smelled faintly of old coffee and winter boots. "Seatbelt," I said automatically, then immediately worried it sounded bossy, like I'd forgotten how to talk to anyone soft. But Carter just nodded and clicked it in place, eyes forward, quiet as a shadow. The drive to my apartment took 10 minutes, and in that time I kept glancing at him in the red glow of stoplights, waiting for him to ask questions. "Where are we going? Are you leaving me? What happens now?" But he didn't. He stared at the windshield like he was watching the world pass by without letting himself belong to it. When we pulled into my building's small lot, he hesitated before getting out, and I realized he was listening to the sounds, the distant traffic, the wind in the bare branches, like he was trying to judge whether this place was safe. "It's not fancy," I said as we climbed the stairs, fumbling for my keys with fingers that were still shaky from the judge's questions. "But it's warm." Carter followed closely, shoes squeaking on the steps, and when I opened the door, the familiar quiet of my apartment swallowed us whole. It was the kind of quiet that used to feel like control, and now felt like emptiness. One lamp in the corner, a small couch, a kitchen that always looked too clean because no one ever cooked anything real. Carter stepped inside and stopped, hugging his backpack to his chest, eyes scanning the room the way stray animals do when they're deciding whether to bolt. I suddenly became painfully aware of what my life looked like. A single plate in the drying rack, a calendar still turned to last month, a framed photo of me and Hannah tucked on a shelf like something I couldn't throw away, even if it hurt to look at. I moved too quickly and turned the frame face down, then hated myself for it, like I was hiding her from him and from myself at the same time. "You can have the couch," I said, trying to sound normal. "I'll get you a blanket." Carter nodded once, then asked in a voice so small it almost disappeared, "Do you have apple juice?" The question was so ordinary, it knocked the air out of me. "No," I admitted, and then I heard a laugh slip out of my throat, quiet and startled, like a door creaking open in a house that's been closed for years. "But I can get some tomorrow. I promise." Carter watched me like he didn't quite believe promises yet, but he nodded again, slow, as if putting it in a box labeled maybe. I found a spare pillow in the closet and an old fleece blanket I'd kept for emergencies. Then I showed him the bathroom, the light switches, the thermostat, explaining things I'd never had to explain to anyone because no one ever stayed. "Miss Larkin will come tomorrow," I told him. "She'll check the place. Ask some questions. It's part of the process." Carter's fingers tightened around his backpack strap. "Am I staying?" he asked, and there it was. Finally, fear sharpened into a single question. I swallowed hard. "Tonight? Yes," I said. "Tomorrow, we'll do everything we can." His eyes dropped to the floor. "Uncle Theo said you wouldn't let me go to the big house," he whispered, and something in my chest pinched so painfully I had to look away. I busied myself pouring him a glass of water, finding crackers in the pantry, turning on the TV at low volume because silence suddenly felt cruel. He ate 2 crackers like he was doing it out of obligation, then sat on the couch with his knees pulled up, eyes fixed on the dark window, as if the river had followed him here. Hours passed in small, awkward movements, me rinsing the same cup twice, him adjusting the blanket without ever fully relaxing. And when I finally told him it was time to sleep, he nodded but didn't lie down. He just sat there, awake and rigid, and I realized he was waiting for the moment people always leave. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did the only thing that felt honest. I sat on the floor, beside the couch, back against it, close but not touching. "I'm right here," I said quietly. Carter didn't respond at first, but after a long minute, his shoulders loosened a fraction, like my presence had shifted something invisible in the room. Somewhere outside, the wind kept scraping at the building, and inside my apartment, my quiet, grief-filled box of a life, there was the faint, fragile sound of another human breathing, and it felt like the beginning of something I was terrified to want. I must have dozed off sitting on the floor, because the next thing I remember is the thin, trembling sound of breathing that wasn't mine, the kind that catches halfway like it's afraid to take up space. And when I lifted my head, the room was dim, except for the orange glow of the streetlight leaking through the blinds, and Carter was sitting upright on the couch with the blanket pooled in his lap, eyes wide and fixed on the dark corner of the ceiling like he was watching something only he could see. "Hey," I whispered, "careful, because the wrong tone can make a scared kid lock up." "You okay?" He didn't answer right away. His throat worked like he was swallowing words that didn't want to come out. "Sometimes," he said finally, voice rough with sleep he hadn't gotten, "it feels like if I fall asleep, everyone will disappear." The sentence hit me so hard I felt it behind my ribs, because it was the same fear grief plants in you. If you close your eyes, the world will change without you, and you won't be able to stop it. I shifted my weight, still on the floor, keeping my hands where he could see them. "I'm still here," I said. "I'm going to be here in the morning, too." Carter stared at me for a long second, as if measuring whether I was the kind of adult who said nice things or the kind who meant them. And then, slowly, he lay back down and turned his face toward the back of the couch, shoulders still tight, but no longer rigid. I stayed where I was until his breathing smoothed out again, until the worst of the night passed, and somewhere in that long quiet, I realized I hadn't thought about my own loneliness once. Not the apartment, not the microwave dinners, not the looping memories of Hannah. There was only this: a kid trying to convince his nervous system it was safe enough to sleep. When morning finally came, it came gray, Portland's usual winter light, and the sound that woke me wasn't an alarm, but Carter padding into the kitchen in socks, the floorboards creaking like they were surprised to be used. I pushed myself up, stiff and sore, and found him standing in front of the sink holding my chipped coffee mug with both hands as if warmth could be borrowed. "Morning," I said, and he flinched slightly, then nodded. "Morning," he echoed, polite. I opened cabinets, trying to remember what I even had besides cereal and instant noodles, and ended up making toast, simple, safe, and he ate without complaint, eyes darting every time a car door slammed outside. When the clock hit 9, my phone buzzed with a text from Miss. "On my way. Home visit. 20 minutes. My stomach tightened all over again. It wasn't just nerves. It was the knowledge that this whole fragile thing could be decided by whether my smoke detector chirped at the wrong time, whether my apartment looked too empty, whether my grief showed too clearly on my face. Carter sat on the couch with the blanket still around his shoulders, even though the heater was running, watching me pace in little useless circles. "Is she taking me?" he asked, and his voice was controlled, but his fingers were gripping the edge of the cushion like he was holding on. I crouched in front of him, trying to make my face honest and calm at the same time. "She's checking that you're safe here," I said. "She's going to ask questions. So am I. That's how they decide things." He swallowed. "Uncle Theo said the system doesn't see people," he whispered. "It sees forms." I didn't know how to argue with a kid who'd learned that kind of truth too early, so I didn't. I just said, "Then we'll make sure they see you." And when the knock came at the door 20 minutes later, Carter's whole body went still. Miss Larkin stepped in with that same tired kindness, eyes scanning the room in quick professional sweeps, outlets, hallway, kitchen, bathroom, while her voice stayed gentle. "Hi, Carter," she said, and he nodded, holding himself together with sheer will. She asked him what he'd eaten, how he'd slept, whether he felt safe, and she asked me about my work schedule, my support network, my plans for school, whether I had any weapons in the home, whether I understood what trauma could look like in a child, anger, withdrawal, nightmares, hoarding food, and I answered everything as plainly as I could, because I didn't want to sound like a hero. I wanted to sound like someone who would still be here after the paperwork stopped being dramatic. At one point, she opened her notebook and said, "Jordan, I need you to understand this could take time," and the way she said it made it clear she'd watched good intentions crumble under waiting. I nodded. "Then I'll wait," I said, and my voice surprised me because it wasn't desperate. It was steady. Miss Larkin looked at Carter, then back at me, and her expression softened in a way that felt like permission, not approval. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll file for an extended temporary placement. No promises yet, but okay." Carter didn't smile, not really, but his shoulders dropped a fraction, and when Miss Larkin turned to leave, he blurted, "Do you have apple juice now?" The question was so blunt it almost made Miss Larkin laugh. I didn't, but I grabbed my keys anyway. "Come on," I told him, and for the first time he followed me to the door without pausing to listen for danger. And as we stepped into the hallway together, I realized something simple and terrifying. This wasn't just a night anymore. This was a beginning. We walked to the corner store like it was the most normal thing in the world, just a man and a kid going out for juice. Yet every step felt like I was carrying something fragile in my hands that I couldn't afford to drop. And Carter stayed half a pace behind me in the hallway until we reached the street, where he edged closer like the open air made him nervous. The morning was damp and colorless, the kind of Portland gray that makes everything look like it's been washed too many times. And I kept catching myself glancing at him the way you glance at an expensive glass you've borrowed, checking for cracks, checking for spills, checking for the moment it slips. Inside the store, the heater was turned up too high, the air smelling like fried snacks and wet wool, and Carter stopped in the doorway as if the bright lights were a trap, then followed when I held the door open and didn't rush him. "Apple juice," I said gently, and he nodded like it was a mission, not a preference, walking straight to the aisle and reaching for the same brand like he'd rehearsed it. He held the bottle against his chest for a second before putting it in the basket, and something about that small, careful claim made my throat tighten. At the checkout, He stared at the candy rack without asking for anything, hands tucked into sleeves, so I grabbed a cheap pack of gum and a little notebook with a spiral binding, not thinking too hard about why, only knowing that a kid who liked sketching boats might need somewhere to put the images he kept trapped behind his eyes. Outside, Carter twisted the cap off the juice and took a long drink, shoulders loosening in the smallest way, and when he handed it back to me to hold while he zipped his jacket, I felt an odd weight of trust settle in my palm. Back at the apartment, the day filled itself with practical problems I'd never had to solve alone. Miss Larkin's follow-up forms, school enrollment questions, a list of numbers to call for counseling resources, and my own job schedule staring at me like a dare. I phoned my supervisor and asked for a temporary shift adjustment, my voice steady even while my stomach flipped, and when he asked why I told him the truth in the simplest way, I have a kid in emergency placement, as if saying it out loud wouldn't make it real enough to disappear. Carter hovered in the doorway while I talked, listening without pretending not to, and after I hung up, he asked, "Does that mean you're mad?" "Mad?" I repeated, confused. He pointed at the phone like it was the source of danger. "That you have to change stuff." I sat down on the edge of the couch so I wasn't towering over him. "No," I said. "It means I'm doing what adults are supposed to do. I'm making room." He blinked slowly, like he'd never heard an adult say that without resentment hiding underneath. And then he walked to the kitchen table, opened the spiral notebook I'd bought, and ran his finger over the blank first page as if the emptiness made him nervous. "You draw?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said, then hesitated. "Uncle Theo said drawing helps when your head is loud." The sentence had a quiet weight to it, an adult trying to translate pain into something a kid could carry. And I felt the sharp edge of anger at the unfairness of it, not at Carter, not even at Theo, but at whatever darkness had made a man leave a child to a bench and a letter. Carter picked up a pen, made a few tentative lines, then stopped and stared at them like he didn't trust his own hands. He pushed the notebook toward me instead. "You do it," he said. "I don't know what to draw." I almost told him I couldn't, that I was terrible at art, that I didn't have the right. Then I remembered how he'd watched me all night, waiting to see if I'd disappear, and I understood that this wasn't about drawing. It was about proof. So I took the pen and drew the simplest thing I could manage: a rectangle for a bench, a wavy line for the river, a crooked stick figure sitting beside another crooked stick figure, and when I slid it back to him, he stared at it like it was a spell. "That's us," he said softly, and it wasn't a question. That evening, he drank apple juice on my couch while I microwaved something that pretended to be dinner. And later, when the apartment quieted down and I expected the old heaviness to settle in, it didn't land the same way. Carter asked if he could leave the hallway light on, and when I said yes, he nodded like he'd just been granted oxygen. I sat on the floor again beside the couch while he drifted toward sleep, listening to his breathing even out. And for the first time since Hannah, I caught myself thinking about tomorrow without flinching. Right up until my phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Larkin that made my stomach drop all over again. "Jordan, call me when you're awake. We have an update about Theo Merrick." I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed, the message from Miss Larkin sitting there like a weight, and for a long minute I didn't move because I was afraid of what her voice would confirm. Afraid that the fragile beginning I'd started to believe in would be cracked by news too heavy for a kid's shoulders. But the longer I waited, the more it felt like I was doing what adults always did in Carter's life. Hesitating, hovering, letting him sit in uncertainty. So I slipped out of the living room as quietly as I could, stepped into the kitchen, and called her with my hand braced against the counter, like I needed something solid to hold me up. She answered on the second ring, her voice lower than usual, stripped of small talk. "Jordan," she said, "I'm sorry to call like this." My throat tightened. "What happened?" There was a pause, just long enough for my mind to run through every possibility and land on the worst one. "They located Theo Merrick," she said carefully. "They recovered him from the river this morning." The words didn't feel real at first, like my brain refused to translate them into meaning, and then my stomach dropped and I had to swallow hard against a surge of nausea. He's gone." I managed, and Miss Larkin's exhale sounded like someone who had been holding her breath for hours. Yes, she said. I'm so sorry. I know Carter has been holding on to the idea that Theo would come back. I squeezed my eyes shut, seeing Carter's calm face, the way he'd said, "You're late," as if waiting was proof the world could be trusted, and anger flared hot and useless in my chest. Anger at Theo for leaving. Anger at the darkness that can hollow a person out until they believe disappearing is the only option. Anger at how a child always ends up paying the bill for an adult's despair. Miss Larkin continued, brisk but gentle, as if she knew the facts could either crush you or hold you upright depending on how they were delivered. The note he left, she said, it's being treated as part of the case file. It helps explain why Carter was left where he was, and it supports the emergency placement decision. But it also means there will be more scrutiny, more questions. Police may want to speak to you again to confirm timeline, and we still need to search for any family connections, even distant ones. I rubbed my palm over my face, trying to push the shock back into a shape I could carry. Is there anyone? I asked. Anyone you found? Not yet, she said. We're running records. Theo wasn't Carter's legal parent, so it's complicated. But Jordan, listen to me. Whatever you say to Carter, do not frame Theo's death as something noble or inevitable. He was struggling. He made a tragic choice. That's all. Carter will need support. Trauma counseling. He may blame himself for not waiting correctly. He may blame you for not bringing Theo back. Her words landed hard because they were true. I looked through the doorway at the living room. Carter was still asleep on the couch, blanket up to his chin, one hand curled around the apple juice bottle like it was a talisman, and the sight of him made my chest ache with a protectiveness I hadn't felt in years. I understand, I whispered. What do I do right now? Be honest but simple, Miss Larkin said. Tell him Theo died. Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him he's safe. And call me after you talk to him. I can come by today. I thanked her. My voice sounded thin, and ended the call, standing there in the quiet kitchen, while my coffee maker gurgled like nothing had changed in the world. For a moment, I just breathed, trying to find the right words. Because the truth is, you can't make a sentence gentle enough to keep it from hurting. You can only decide whether it hurts alone or hurts with someone holding your hand. I walked back into the living room and knelt beside the couch, watching Carter's eyelashes flutter as he drifted toward waking. And when his eyes opened, he blinked at me, soft and sleepy for the first time since I'd met him. Morning, he murmured. I swallowed, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Hey, buddy, I said, keeping my voice steady even as my hands trembled. I talked to Miss Larkin. Carter sat up slowly, the blanket sliding to his waist, his face already tightening as if he could sense bad news in the air. Is Uncle Theo coming? He asked, and the hope in the question was so bare it hurt to look at. I reached out and rested my hand on the edge of the couch near his knee, close enough to be there, not so close that it stole his space. Carter, I said quietly, they found Theo this morning. He died. The room went still. Carter didn't cry. His eyes just locked on mine as if he didn't understand the language anymore. No, he said, and it wasn't denial like a tantrum. It was denial like a child trying to hold the world together with one word. He said he'd come back. My throat burned. I know, I said. I know he said that, and I'm so sorry. But this wasn't because of you. You didn't do anything wrong. His breathing sped up, sharp and shallow, and then the calm finally shattered. He shoved the blanket off and jumped off the couch, fists clenched at his sides. Then why did he tell me to wait? He snapped, voice cracking. Why did he make me sit there like a stupid? He stopped, choking on the rest, and for the first time, I saw the kid under the composure. Furious, terrified, abandoned. I stood slowly, keeping my hands open. Because he loved you, I said, and my voice shook now because there was no way around it. Because he was sick in a way people can't always see. Because the part of him that loved you was trying to protect you, even when the rest of him couldn't keep going. But you're not alone now. Carter's eyes flooded finally, and he turned his face away like tears were something he was ashamed of. You don't know that, he whispered. Everybody leaves. The sentence hit me like a blade because it was the fear I'd been living with too, just dressed in different clothes, and I stepped closer, not rushing, until I was beside him, steady as I could make myself. I can't fix what Theo did, I said. I can't bring him back, but I can make you one promise that I control. Carter's shoulders trembled. He didn't look at me. What? He asked, voice small again. I took a breath and let the words land clean, without drama. I'm not leaving, I said. Not today, not tomorrow, not if you scream at me or shut me out or stop believing in promises. I'm here. Carter didn't answer my promise right away. He just stood there with his face turned toward the window, shoulders shaking in tiny, stubborn bursts, like his body was trying to decide whether it was safe to fall apart. And the longer the silence stretched, the more I understood that this was the moment where adults usually filled the air with excuses or quick comfort. He's in a better place. Everything happens for a reason. Things that sounded nice but didn't hold up under a child's anger. So I stayed quiet and let the truth be plain. After a while, he wiped his cheeks with the sleeve of my jacket, rough and furious, and said, You can't promise that, like he was daring me to admit I was just another temporary person. I can promise what I choose, I said softly. I can't control the whole world, but I can control whether I walk out that door. He stared at the floor for a long time, jaw tight, and then, as if the effort of holding himself together had finally run out, he sank onto the edge of the couch and pressed his fists into his eyes. The sob that came out of him wasn't loud. It was small and strangled, like he'd been trying not to make noise his whole life, and the sound cracked something in me so cleanly I almost couldn't breathe. I sat down on the coffee table across from him, close enough that he could feel I was there, far enough that he didn't have to perform anything for me, and when his crying shifted into quiet hiccups, I slid a box of tissues onto the cushion beside him without comment. He took one, then another, wiping his face hard like he was angry at his own tears. He shouldn't have said it, he muttered. He shouldn't have told me you'd come. He shouldn't have. He stopped, swallowing the rest, and I didn't finish the sentence for him because he deserved to say it in his own time. It wasn't fair, I said instead, simple and true, and that was the first thing that made him look up, eyes red and sharp. Was it my fault? He asked, and his voice went thin on the last word, like it was the question he'd been carrying in his mouth since the bench. My chest tightened. No, I said immediately. No, Carter, adults' choices are not kids' fault. Theo was hurting in a way you couldn't fix, and it was never your job to fix him. He stared at me like he didn't fully believe me, like he'd been trained to think love meant responsibility, and I added, The best thing you did was survive. You waited. You stayed safe. You made it. A knock came at the door an hour later, Miss Larkin arriving earlier than she'd planned, and Carter stiffened, wiping his face quickly, trying to put the mask back on. She stepped in gently, taking in the room with one glance and Carter with another, and her voice softened when she said his name. Hi, Carter, she murmured. I'm really sorry about Theo. Carter didn't respond, but he didn't bolt either, which felt like a tiny victory. Miss Larkin sat at the kitchen table and spoke to me in low tones about next steps. Police would need a statement about where and when I found Carter. There would be a formal case review, and a grief counselor could be arranged as soon as possible. Not because Carter was broken, she emphasized, but because a kid shouldn't have to carry this kind of loss without help. She asked Carter if he wanted to talk, and he shrugged, eyes fixed on the carpet. But when she offered a small laminated card with her number and said, If you get scared, call me, he took it and tucked it into the pocket of my jacket like it belonged there. After she left, the apartment fell quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was a quiet with a child inside it, a quiet that required attention. Carter wandered to the kitchen table, opened the spiral notebook I'd bought, and started drawing with quick, angry strokes, pressing hard enough that the paper tore slightly. I didn't hover. I cleaned dishes that didn't need cleaning. I made a list of things we'd need if he stayed. Real food, school supplies, a bed. And when I glanced over, I saw what he'd drawn. A bench by the river, 2 stick figures, and a third figure standing farther away, half faded like a shadow. And underneath it, he wrote in block letters that looked like they took all his strength. Not your fault. He stared at the words for a long time, then pushed the notebook toward me without speaking, and I understood that he wasn't asking me to read it, he was asking me to hold it with him. I sat down beside him and rested my hand near the edge of the page, not covering his drawing, just anchoring it. And for the first time since he'd asked me if people always leave, he leaned just slightly into my shoulder, a small weight, cautious but real. And in that moment, I knew the next part wouldn't be dramatic or easy or fast. It would be appointments and paperwork and nightmares and mornings when he didn't want to get out of bed. And it would also be apple juice in the fridge, light left on in the hallway, and a promise kept one ordinary day at a time. The next few days blurred into a strange new rhythm where time was measured less by clocks and more by check-ins, phone calls, and the small ways Carter's fear surfaced like a bruise you didn't notice until you pressed it. A detective came by the apartment to take my statement, sitting stiffly at my kitchen table while I described the bench, the cold, the jacket, the way Carter had said I was late, and I watched Carter from the corner of my eye the whole time, because he kept his face blank, but his foot tapped the floor in tiny panicked beats. And when the detective asked him a question, softly, professionally, Carter answered in short sentences without looking up, like eye contact might make the truth heavier. After they left, he went straight to the notebook and drew hard lines until his knuckles went pale. And I learned quickly that fine wasn't a feeling. It was a cover. Miss Larkin called every day with updates that were both reassuring and terrifying. No immediate relatives located, a case review scheduled, counseling referrals submitted, and each time she said, "This takes time," I felt my stomach clench because time was exactly what Carter didn't trust. I rearranged my living room to make space for him without turning it into a museum of carefulness. I bought a cheap twin mattress and shoved my own desk against the wall. I taped a nightlight into the hallway outlet because he kept waking up and checking the door like he expected the world to vanish. And I stocked the fridge with apple juice, real fruit, and the bland, kid-friendly things you don't appreciate until you're trying to convince a scared child to eat. My supervisor approved the shift change, and the first morning I walked Carter to the nearby elementary school to talk about enrollment. He clutched his backpack straps so hard the fabric creased, scanning every doorway like adults might step out and claim him in opposite directions. And when the secretary smiled and said, "Hi, sweetheart," he flinched as if kindness was something that always came with conditions. The counselor Miss Larkin recommended met us in a quiet office with soft chairs and a box of fidget toys. And Carter didn't say much at first. Shrug, silence, eyes on the carpet. But when the counselor asked if he had nightmares, his fingers tightened around a little rubber dinosaur, and he whispered, "Sometimes I dream I'm still on the bench and I can't feel my legs." And my chest tightened so hard I had to look at the wall to keep my face from breaking. That night, he refused dinner, and I didn't push. I just sat across from him at the table and ate a few bites of my own food so he could see the world didn't end because he wasn't hungry. And later, when he finally crawled onto the mattress and pulled the blanket up to his nose, he asked, "Are they going to make you give me back?" Like it was a weather forecast he needed to prepare for. I chose my words carefully because the truth mattered more than comfort. "They're going to ask questions," I said. "They're going to be careful, but I'm not giving up on you, okay? Even if it's slow." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded once, not trusting it fully, but storing it anyway. The case review happened on a Thursday in a bland office building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, and I sat at a long table with Miss Larkin and two other workers I hadn't met while Carter waited in a playroom down the hall. And it was the strangest feeling, having my life discussed in bullet points: employment stable, home safe, background check clear, emotional capacity to be monitored, as if love needed a checkbox. One woman asked, "Why are you doing this?" And I could have given a speech, but I just said the simplest, truest thing, because I stopped, and now I can't unsee him. Miss Larkin watched me with that weary human look, then said, "Carter has shown signs of attachment to Mr. Rivers." And I almost laughed at the clinical phrasing, because what it really meant was that Carter had started leaving his shoes by the door like he lived there, and he'd begun to say "we" without catching himself. When we got home after the meeting, Carter didn't ask how it went right away. He just went to the fridge, took out apple juice, and handed me one too, like it was a ritual, then sat on the edge of the couch and waited, eyes searching my face. "They're not moving you tonight," I said gently, and the air left his body in a shaky exhale. He didn't smile, but he leaned back into the cushions like his spine had finally decided the couch could hold him. And later, when I found a new drawing on the kitchen table, 3 stick figures again, but this time the shadow figure was smaller, farther away, and the 2 on the bench were drawn with thicker lines, I realized we weren't racing towards some dramatic happy ending. We were building something sturdier than that, day by day, with paperwork on one side and ordinary life on the other, and in the middle, a kid learning, slowly, bravely, that staying could be real. The weeks turned into months, the way winter turns into spring in Portland. Slowly, stubbornly, with days that still felt gray, even when the calendar insisted something should be blooming. And somewhere in that stretch of time, Carter stopped feeling like a visitor and started feeling like the quiet center of my apartment's new gravity. It happened in small, almost invisible shifts, like the first time he left his toothbrush in the cup without asking if it was okay, or the first time he dropped his backpack by the door and walked straight to the kitchen like he belonged there, or the night he had a nightmare and didn't freeze in silence but stumbled into the hallway and called my name in a cracked whisper that yanked me awake faster than any alarm ever could. I found him standing in the dim light with his fists clenched, eyes wide, breathing hard, and instead of pretending I didn't see it, instead of retreating the way I used to retreat from anything that might hurt, I opened my arms without making it a big deal, and he hesitated. 1 beat, 2 then stepped into me, like his body had been waiting for permission to stop fighting alone. He didn't sob, not loudly, he just shook, and I held him until the tremors eased and his shoulders dropped. And when he finally backed away, he didn't say thank you. Because kids shouldn't have to thank adults for showing up. He just said, "Can the light stay on?" And I said, "Always," and meant it. Miss Larkin checked in less often after that, not because she'd forgotten us, but because there were fewer fires to put out. The placement order got extended, then extended again, and the home visits became almost routine. Smoke alarms, fridge stocked, school attendance consistent, counseling sessions attended, and each time someone with a clipboard came into my space, I felt the old fear flare up, the fear that I'd be judged not just for what I had, but for what I'd lost. But Carter kept surprising me with how he grew around his grief, instead of being swallowed by it. He started speaking in the counselor's office more, not about Theo at first, but about ordinary things, how he hated math, how the lunchroom was loud, how he liked the river because it made his head quieter. And then one day he drew a picture of the bench and said, flat and brave, "I'm mad at him." And when the counselor asked who, Carter didn't flinch. He said, "Because he left, and because he made me think it was my job to wait right." Hearing that, I felt a fierce, aching pride, because anger meant he was claiming his own innocence. Anger meant he wasn't turning the blame inward. Around the same time, my supervisor offered me my old schedule back, and I surprised myself by saying no. I wanted evenings, I wanted mornings, I wanted to be the person who could pick him up when school called about a fever or a fight or a panic attack. And when I hung up the phone, I caught Carter watching me from the kitchen table, pen paused over his notebook. "You changed it for me," he said, like he was trying to understand the mechanics of being chosen. "I changed it because we're a team," I replied, and the word we felt like something warm settling into place. The official step toward adoption didn't happen in one dramatic announcement. It crept up through meetings and signatures and questions that forced me to look my own life in the eye. Did I have support? Did I understand permanence? Was I prepared for the hard parts that came after the cute parts? And every time the social worker asked if I was sure, I thought about the night I almost walked past that bench, and how close Carter had been to becoming another invisible story in a city full of them. When the court date finally arrived, I wore the only suit I owned, and Carter wore a button-down shirt that made him look older than 13, had any right to look. And he sat beside me in the courthouse hallway, swinging his feet while pretending he wasn't nervous. His fingers found mine under the armrest, squeezing once, as if to remind himself I was real. Inside the judge's chambers, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. And the judge, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes sharpened by years of hard decisions, looked at me over her glasses. "Mr. Rivers," she said, "this is permanent. This child has endured loss and instability. Are you prepared to be his parent in every way that matters, not just when it feels meaningful?" I looked at Carter, at the way his jaw tightened as he waited for my answer like it could decide his entire future, and I heard my own voice come out steady. "Yes," I said. "Not because I'm some hero. Because he's my family." Carter's breath caught, small and surprised, and the judge nodded, signing papers with a slow finality that made my hands tremble. When we walked out of that building into the thin spring sunlight, Carter blinked up at the sky like it was too bright, too possible, and he said, almost suspiciously, "So that's it." I swallowed, feeling something like joy and grief braided together in my chest. "That's it," I said. "You're stuck with me." He stared at me for a beat. Then, so quick he almost missed it, his mouth twitched into a smile, and later that afternoon, without either of us planning it, we found ourselves back down at the waterfront, walking toward the cherry trees and the bench that had started everything, and Carter reached into his backpack and pulled out a cheap kite he'd bought with allowance money, bright against the pale sky, holding it out to me like a question. "Ready?" he asked, and I took the string, feeling the wind tug, feeling the line grow taut, and for the first time in a long time, the rock in my chest didn't feel like a weight. It felt like an anchor, proof I'd been pulled back into life instead of drifting away. Life will hand you nights that feel like winter, cold, unfair, and long enough to make you believe nothing warm is coming back. When that happens, don't underestimate the power of one simple choice. Stop. Stop walking past what hurts. Stop telling yourself, it's not my problem. Stop waiting for a perfect moment to be kind. Most of the time, healing doesn't arrive as a miracle. It arrives as a jacket placed on someone's shoulders, a light left on in the hallway, a promise kept the next morning and the next. If you've been through loss, don't let it convince you that caring is dangerous. Caring is what pulls you back from becoming a ghost in your own life. And if you're the one sitting on the bench, scared, angry, convinced everyone leaves, remember this. The fact that someone else failed you doesn't mean you're unworthy of staying. Ask for help. Accept help. Let people prove themselves over time. The world can be indifferent, systems can be slow, and pain can be loud, but ordinary love, consistent, quiet, showing up again, has a way of rebuilding a life one day at a time.